The official story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, as related in 1 Kings 10 and 2 Chronicles 9, is only a small part of a much richer and more complex narrative preserved in Ethiopian traditions. The truth is that the book Kebra Nagast, a sacred text for Ethiopia, reveals fascinating details about the Queen of Sheba, known as Makeda, and her crucial role in the spiritual and political history of the ancient African and Middle Eastern world. According to this account, Makeda was not just a passing ruler. She was a black-skinned, powerful and spiritual monarch, ruling a prosperous kingdom in territories now encompassing Ethiopia and Yemen, known for its trade in spices, gold and incense. Reality shows that Makeda's interest in Solomon was not limited to a simple test of wisdom. His journey to Jerusalem had deep motivations, seeking to forge an alliance that transcended the material, spiritually uniting two of the most influential kingdoms of antiquity. Solomon, known for his legendary wisdom, saw in Makeda not only an equal in intellect but also a spiritual partner. This meeting, narrated in rich and detailed form in Kebra Nagast, resulted in a bond that was not only political but also personal and romantic. Evidence indicates that from this relationship a son was born, Menelik I, who would become a central figure in the history of Ethiopia. Ethiopian tradition states that Menelik, upon visiting Jerusalem as an adult, returned to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant. It is this narrative that suggests that the Ark, the ultimate symbol of divine presence and spiritual power, was taken to Ethiopia, where, according to these traditions, it remains to this day, kept in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum. Makeda, or Bilqis, as she is called in Islamic tradition, was more than a figure of political power. She was a spiritual leader whose wisdom and vision transcended her time. His legacy, perpetuated through Menelik and the Solomonic dynasty, profoundly influenced Ethiopia's religious and cultural history. This dynasty, which claimed direct descent from Solomon and Makeda, ruled almost uninterruptedly until 1974, when the Ethiopian monarchy was abolished. Documents prove that Ethiopia has always attached great importance to its connection with the Queen of Sheba and Solomon, using this heritage to assert its uniqueness as one of the oldest Christian nations in the world. The story of Makeda and Solomon is not just a tale of power and love, but a narrative about the transfer of symbolism and spiritual power, cementing Ethiopia as a center of faith and tradition that endures to the present day. The question that arises is, how does this narrative, so rich and imbued with spiritual and political symbolism, continue to shape the identity and history of a modern nation like Ethiopia? Why doesn't the Bible mention the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba? Ethiopian tradition preserves a rich and detailed account of what would be a significant omission in the biblical texts. The Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian sacred text, reveals that Solomon, enchanted by the majestic Queen Makeda, spared no effort to conquer her. He impressed her with grand banquets, demonstrations of his immense wealth, wisdom, and the magnificence of his temple. Makeda, initially resistant, eventually gave in to the king's charm, resulting in a night together. From this union, Menelik I was born, who became one of the most important emperors of Ethiopia. The reality shows that this story was not recorded in the Bible, raising questions about possible edits or omissions. We may wonder whether the absence of this mention was an attempt to hide a relationship that could challenge the cultural and racial norms of the time, or whether it was simply an issue considered irrelevant to the Israeli narrative. What few realize is that, in Ethiopian tradition, this story is not only accepted, but central to the country's national and spiritual identity. The Kebra Nagast, although written in the 14th century, is based on older manuscripts and is considered a religious text of great importance by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Evidence points to the seriousness with which Menelik I's lineage was treated in Ethiopia. Until the abolition of the monarchy in 1974, any Ethiopian emperor needed to prove their direct descent from Menelik I to be crowned, which reinforces the belief that the Solomonic dynasty was divine and predestined. This tradition was so deep-rooted that it was part of the Ethiopian imperial constitution, highlighting the depth with which this narrative influenced the country's history. History reveals that Menelik not only became a central figure in Ethiopian politics, but also a symbol of a spiritual connection with ancient Israel. According to tradition, Menelik visited Jerusalem in his youth, and upon returning to Ethiopia, brought with him the Ark of the Covenant, one of the most sacred artifacts of Judaism. This narrative gives Ethiopia a unique role in preserving one of the most sacred aspects of Hebrew tradition, suggesting that Africa not only received but also safeguarded a fundamental part of the religious symbolism of the Middle East. It turns out that preserving this history in Ethiopia is not only an act of cultural resistance, but also an affirmation of identity and spiritual continuity. Sheba is seen not just as a historical account, but as a living testimony to the divine roots of the Ethiopian people, inspiring generations to recognize their heritage as part of the divine plan. The question that arises is, to what extent does this history shape the perception of Ethiopia as a chosen nation and keeper of ancient secrets? What motivated Menelik to refuse Solomon's invitation to remain in Israel? According to Sheba, the answer transcends personal desire and taps into the deep spiritual and cultural roots that bind Ethiopia to its sacred destiny. Menelik, son of the Queen of Sheba and the wise King Solomon, carried in his blood the promise of uniting two great traditions. By deciding to return to Ethiopia, he was not only choosing a life of leadership in his homeland, but also fulfilling what he believed was a divine calling to establish a lineage that would rule Ethiopia under God's protection and blessing. Solomon, although eager to have his son by his side, respected Menelik's decision and, in a gesture of recognition and support, anointed him as king of Ethiopia, thus sealing a spiritual alliance between the two kingdoms. The truth is that this alliance was not limited to symbolic gestures. Solomon sent with Menelik a group of young Israelites, sons of priests and nobles, to establish a lasting connection between the cultures and traditions of the two peoples. Among these young men, Azariah, son of the high priest Zadok, played a crucial role. He and his companions, driven by deep faith and a desire to secure divine blessing for the new dynasty, hatched an audacious plan. They decided to take with them the Ark of the Covenant, Judaism's most sacred artifact, believing that its presence in Ethiopia would guarantee protection and divine favor for Menelik's new reign. The facts reveal that this daring operation involved replacing the real Ark with a replica, skillfully made to deceive any superficial inspection. When Solomon discovered the disappearance of the Ark, Menelik's caravan had already crossed the desert, and the distance made any attempt at recovery impossible. Consulting his prophets, Solomon received a revelation that brought peace to his heart. The transfer of the Ark was part of the divine plan. God had allowed and even desired that the Ark find a new home in Africa, consolidating Ethiopia as a spiritual center of great importance. Documents prove that for Ethiopia, the arrival of the Ark represented not only a spiritual gain, but a confirmation of its role as guardian of divine secrets. Ethiopian tradition fervently maintains the narrative that the Ark still rests in Axum, in the Church of St. Mary of Zion, protected by a lineage of guardians who dedicate their lives to preserving what they believe to be one of the most sacred relics in the world. Despite the skepticism of many Western historians, for millions of Ethiopians, this story is a living truth, which reinforces the country's national and spiritual identity. The question that remains is, How does such a rich and controversial narrative continue to challenge our perceptions of where true spiritual and cultural power lies? In a world that often disregards non-Western traditions, the story of Menelik and the Ark of the Covenant is a testament to the resilience and importance of narratives that challenge the status quo and reclaim Africa as a vital center of faith and history. The reality is that Ethiopia, in its history of relative isolation, has developed a tradition that has preserved ancient secrets, especially around the Ark of the Covenant. Aksum, the historic city that is home to the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion, is considered the focal point of this tradition. The Ark, it is believed, is kept in an inaccessible enclosure where only the designated guardian can enter. This guardian is chosen to spend the rest of his life in devotion and protection, without ever leaving the place or allowing others to see what is inside. This practice is not just a religious ritual, but an affirmation of Ethiopia's spiritual identity as guardian of a sacred relic that, if true, would redefine the understanding of religious history. What few realize is that the secret of the Ark is not necessarily a matter of conspiracy, but of respect and reverence. The Jewish tradition in Ethiopia, prior to Christianity, is evidenced by the Beta Israel, whose presence dates back to the times of Solomon. The religious practices of the Beta Israel reflect a form of Judaism that diverged before the destruction of the First Temple, suggesting that its connection to the ancient Israelites is deep and authentic. While Rabbinic Judaism evolved after the Babylonian exile, Ethiopian Jews maintained rituals and customs that may have been closer to the practices of ancient Israel. Historical records show that Ethiopia was visited by European explorers between the 16th and 18th centuries, who reported mysterious processions in which a sacred covered object was carried with great reverence. These reports, although indirect, offer valuable clues about the continuity of a tradition that could, in fact, house the Ark. The accounts of these explorers, often dismissed as mere historical curiosities, may in fact be fragments of a deeper truth, which Ethiopia, with its history of isolation and resistance, has managed to preserve. It turns out that this narrative of isolation has become a natural protection. While Israel faced invasion and destruction, Ethiopia's geography, with its mountains and deserts, offered a safe haven. This protection allowed not only the survival of a religious tradition, but also the preservation of a unique identity that has withstood the winds of history. Over the centuries, Ethiopia has not only maintained its traditions, but also intertwined them with the narrative of the Ark, creating a story that is both myth and possible reality. Evidence points to the seriousness with which the Ethiopians treat the issue of the Ark. Although many researchers and governments have tried to investigate, all attempts have been respectfully rejected. This refusal is not an act of stubbornness, but a reflection of the spiritual and cultural importance that the Ark represents for the Ethiopian people. For them, the Ark is not just an artifact, but a living symbol of divine presence and the continuity of a heritage that dates back to biblical times. The question that arises is, if Ethiopia really keeps the Ark of the Covenant, what does this mean for the history of Judeo-Christian traditions? In a world where empirical evidence is valued, the story of the Ark in Ethiopia challenges convention and invites deeper reflection on what we hold to be true. It is possible that, amid the silence of the mountains and sacred respect, Ethiopia has preserved one of the greatest secrets in the world's spiritual history. The possibility that the Ark of the Covenant is in Ethiopia defies centuries of religious and historical narrative. Reality shows that if the Ark really rests in Aksum, this subverts the traditional view of the spiritual epicenter. For Israel, the Ark is a symbol of divine presence, and even if absent, its presumed location has always been Jerusalem. If Ethiopia, an African country with a rich Orthodox tradition, truly guards the Ark, it would signify a transfer of spiritual centrality that many are unwilling to accept. Documents prove that Ethiopia has maintained this narrative for centuries, with the Church of St. Mary of Zion being the sacred place where, according to tradition, the Ark rests. This place, inaccessible to the public and protected by a lifelong guardian, symbolizes the respect and reverence with which Ethiopians treat this heritage. It turns out that the resistance to accepting the Ark in Ethiopia is not only theological, but also political and cultural. For Western Christianity, to admit that the Ark is in the custody of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church would be to recognize a spiritual role that has historically been minimized or ignored. This would create a precedent where African spiritual authority, often marginalized, would be legitimized. History reveals that over the centuries, African oral traditions were disregarded in favor of evidence that fit Western narratives. Western archaeology, often suspicious of traditions not based on tangible evidence, chooses to discredit reports that cannot be investigated with conventional scientific methods. The facts reveal that the Bible, in its texts, does not mention the destruction of the Ark. In 2 Chronicles 35, during the reign of Josiah, the Ark is still mentioned, but after that it disappears from the records. This biblical silence fuels speculation about his fate. When Nebuchadnezzar invaded Jerusalem in 587 BC, many believed he had destroyed or taken the Ark. However, the absence of any mention of the Ark during the Babylonian exile, a period when Jews intensely mourned the destruction of the temple, is puzzling. This may indicate that, for the exiles, the Ark was already safe, possibly in Ethiopia, far from the conflicts in the Middle East. Evidence suggests that Ethiopia's Ark narrative is not just a legendary tale, but an essential element of the country's national and spiritual identity. The Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian sacred text, details how Menelik I, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, brought the Ark to Ethiopia, consolidating the country as a spiritual center. The preservation of this account over the centuries, even in the face of external skepticism, demonstrates how deeply this story is rooted in Ethiopian culture. For many Ethiopians, the Ark represents more than a religious artifact. She is a living symbol of a divine covenant and a proof of her spiritual heritage. What few realize is that this narrative challenges not only traditional Judeo-Christian theology, but also the way history is told and validated. In a world that values empirical evidence, the story of the Ark in Ethiopia invites us to reconsider the role of oral tradition and non-Western narratives in our collective understanding of the past. The question that remains is, are we ready to accept that the spiritual center of the world may not be where we always believed? The discovery that the Ark of the Covenant rests on Ethiopian soil would not only transform world religious perception, but also realign the axis of spiritual history, shifting it from the West to the heart of Africa. Such a revelation would challenge the spiritual supremacy that the West has claimed for centuries, demanding a global recognition of Ethiopia's continuing and unifying spiritual importance. The truth is that if the Ark is really in Aksum, this would confirm that Africa, often marginalized in historical and religious narratives, is the guardian of one of the most sacred symbols of the Judeo-Christian tradition. This fact would resonate deeply in a world that still struggles to fully recognize the spiritual and cultural richness of the African continent. The facts reveal that the Bible makes significant references to Ethiopia, highlighting it as a space of divine relevance. Psalm 68:31 mentions Ethiopia stretching out her hands to God, a powerful image that symbolizes an intimate and respectful spiritual connection. This verse, often overlooked, gains new depth when considered in light of the possibility of the Ark of the Covenant being in Ethiopia. Furthermore, Acts 8 describes the encounter between Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, one of the first missionary acts that would bring Christianity back to Ethiopia. This event is emblematic of the enduring spiritual relationship between Israel and the African nation, suggesting a two-way exchange of faith and culture that endures to the present day. Historical documents show that the Ethiopian Christian tradition, one of the oldest outside Israel, has become deeply rooted in the country's culture, surviving invasions and external pressures. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for example, has preserved practices and rituals that date back to its ancient origins, often diverging from Western traditions. This cultural and spiritual isolation has allowed Ethiopia to maintain a unique religious identity that resists the homogenization brought about by colonization and globalization. The presence of the Ark would further strengthen this identity, cementing Ethiopia's position as a vital pillar in the history of the Abrahamic faith. It turns out that recognizing Ethiopia as the true guardian of the Ark of the Covenant would require a re-evaluation of prevailing historical narratives, which often downplay African contributions to world history. This would mean accepting that Africa is not only a continent of natural resources, but also a fundamental source of spirituality and knowledge. This acceptance would transform the way the world sees Africa, not as a periphery of human development, but as a center of ancestral wisdom and spiritual power. Evidence suggests that this change in perspective could have profound political and cultural consequences. Legitimizing Ethiopia's spiritual role could strengthen its position on the international stage, inspiring a cultural and spiritual renaissance across the African continent. This could also encourage more inclusive interfaith dialogues that recognize the diversity and depth of African traditions, rather than simply trying to assimilate them into a dominant Western narrative. Reality shows that accepting the presence of the Ark in Ethiopia would also imply a revision of the history of Judeo-Christian traditions, highlighting Ethiopia as a guardian of ancient secrets that challenge conventional versions of sacred texts. This forces us to question what else may have been omitted or altered in historical and religious narratives, and to explore how we can integrate these hidden truths into our current understanding. The question that remains is, will we be able to embrace this transformative truth and recognize Africa as a spiritual center of global relevance? This acceptance would not only redefine our understanding of religious history, but also invite us to reimagine our collective future in light of the lessons that Ethiopia, with its rich and complex heritage, has to offer. Timkat, celebrated annually in Ethiopia, is not merely a religious festival, but the visceral expression of an ancient tradition. During this celebration, replicas of the Ark of the Covenant, known as tabots, are carried in procession through all churches, symbolizing the divine presence among the Ethiopian people. For millions of participants, this is no mere historical reenactment, but a living testimony to faith that transcends generations. This festival, marked by vibrant colors, spiritual songs, and massive community participation, reflects a national identity that refuses to be erased. The truth is that Timkat is more than a ceremony of faith. It represents the cultural resistance of a people who preserve their traditions against the tide of modernity. While many countries succumb to cultural homogenization, Ethiopia stands out for keeping its roots deeply connected to sacred narratives. This annual event is a powerful reminder that spirituality in Ethiopia is not a matter of the past, but an active and defining element of the present. The Tabot procession is not just a ritual, it is a declaration of continuity and resistance in the face of the challenges that the modern world imposes on ancient traditions. What few realize is that the belief that the Ark of the Covenant is kept in Ethiopia is not simple folklore. Non-Western scholars are increasingly investigating the possibility that this tradition has real historical foundations. The narrative that Menelik I, son of Solomon, and the Queen of Sheba brought the ark to Ethiopia is a story deeply rooted in Ethiopian culture. According to this belief, the ark remains in the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Aksum, protected by devoted guardians who dedicate their lives to this sacred purpose. History reveals that Ethiopia has, for centuries, been a nation that sees itself as the guardian of a colossal spiritual secret. Ethiopian prophecy states that the ark will only be revealed to the world when the African nation rises as a global spiritual power. This expectation is not a vague wish, but rather a deeply rooted belief in national identity. Ethiopia, once one of the most powerful civilizations of antiquity, preserves hope that its spiritual role will be recognized worldwide. Evidence points to Ethiopia's growing relevance in the contemporary world. On a global stage, where nations seek authentic spiritual roots, Ethiopia offers a model of cultural resilience and unwavering faith. The Ethiopian cultural and religious revival is on the rise, and many see this as a harbinger of the fulfillment of prophecy. As the world watches, Ethiopia continues to cultivate its rich spiritual heritage, awaiting the moment when the ark, the ultimate symbol of its faith and history, will be revealed. The question that arises is Ethiopia really destined to become a globally recognized spiritual power? And if so, what impact will this revelation have on the understanding of Judeo-Christian traditions and the global perception of Africa as a center of spiritual power? In recent years, uncertainty has surrounded the location of the Ark of the Covenant, with Israeli archaeologists now publicly acknowledging that their previous theories may only be conjecture. This admission marks a significant shift in the historical and archaeological approach to one of the most sacred artifacts of the ancient world. The Ethiopian theory, which has long been relegated to a corner of speculation, is beginning to gain strength and silent respect behind the scenes of academic discussions. Off-the-record reports suggesting that the Ark may actually be in Ethiopia are increasingly common, especially as relations between Israel and Ethiopia strengthen. Reality shows that this alliance is not only based on political or economic interests, but also on a deeper cultural and spiritual exchange. Operations Moses and Solomon, which rescued thousands of Ethiopian Jews, known as Beta Israel, were milestones in this relationship. These operations not only safeguarded lives, but also revived historic ties between the two countries. Some believe this renewed goodwill may be indirectly linked to the possibility that Ethiopia holds the key to one of the greatest mysteries in religious history. Historical records show that Ethiopia has long held the narrative that the Ark of the Covenant was transported to Aksum by Menelik I, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This story, preserved at Kebra Nagast, is considered by many Ethiopians to be a pillar of their national and spiritual identity. The belief that the Ark still resides in St. Mary of Zion Church is not merely a folk tale, but a living tradition that shapes the country's culture and faith. It turns out that if one day Ethiopia allowed a full archaeological investigation, the implications would be monumental. Confirming the presence of the Ark on African soil would not only rewrite entire chapters of biblical history, but would also reaffirm Africa's role as a spiritual center of global importance. This would challenge the traditional Western perception that spiritual centrality lies only in the historical landmarks of the Middle East. Evidence suggests that the revelation of the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia could trigger a re-evaluation of prevailing religious and historical narratives. Africa, often seen only as the cradle of humanity in anthropological terms, would also be recognized as the guardian of divine secrets. This recognition would not only elevate Ethiopia's spiritual status, but also reinforce the importance of the African continent in building the world's spiritual and cultural heritage. The question that arises is, are we ready to accept that the key to one of the greatest mysteries of the Judeo-Christian faith may be kept on an African altar? The presence of the Ark in Ethiopia could not only alter our understanding of history, but also invite us to reconsider Africa's role as a guardian of the sacred. Ethiopia, with its rich tapestry of spiritual traditions, holds one of the greatest secrets in religious history, the Ark of the Covenant. But the question is, why Ethiopia? Reality shows that over the centuries, this country has maintained an attitude of deep respect and reverence towards this sacred artifact. While many nations could have turned the Ark into a symbol of power or a tourist attraction, Ethiopia chose a different path, where the sacred is protected and venerated in silence. This choice reveals a deep layer of spiritual understanding, where wisdom lies not in display, but in the preservation of that which is divine. What few realize is that this Ethiopian tradition of guarding the Ark without ostentation is supported by an ancient narrative, deeply rooted in national identity. According to the Kebra Nagast, an Ethiopian sacred text, the Ark was brought to Axum by Menelik the Fiend, son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This account is not just a tale, but a pillar of Ethiopian culture and faith, which sees this story as confirmation of the special role that Ethiopia plays on the global spiritual stage. Contrary to the Western tendency to exploit the sacred for material gain, Ethiopia chose the path of safeguarding mystery, a testament to its devotion to divinity and shared history with ancient Israel. Historical records show that the Church of St. Mary of Zion in Axum is considered the sanctuary where the Ark rests. Guarded by a single priest whose life is dedicated to protecting this artifact, the Ark remains inaccessible to the public. This tradition of isolation and devotion highlights the difference between the Ethiopian and Western approaches. The guardian of the Ark lives in seclusion, never leaving the sacred precincts, a practice that underlines Ethiopia's commitment to protecting the sacred. The silence around the Ark is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty, but a powerful testimony of faith and respect for the divine. It turns out that this posture of reverence and protection has given Ethiopia a spiritual uniqueness that few countries can claim. While the modern world leans toward the visibility and monetization of sacred relics, Ethiopia espouses the idea that true spiritual power lies in the preservation of mystery. Ethiopian tradition suggests that the Ark does not need to be seen to be powerful. Their mere presence is enough to transform the nation into a spiritual center of great importance. For Ethiopia, the Ark is more than an artifact. It is a direct link with the divine, a manifestation of the covenant between God and humanity. Evidence suggests that this choice to protect rather than display is not just a matter of tradition, but a spiritual strategy that reflects ancestral wisdom. By keeping the Ark out of the spotlight, Ethiopia preserves its spiritual integrity and affirms its role as guardian of a sacred secret. This respect for the sacred is a powerful lesson in a world that often forgets the value of what cannot be seen or quantified. Ultimately, the true face of the covenant between God and humanity may lie precisely in the ability to preserve what is sacred with humility and respect. The question that arises is, in a world that places greater value on what can be displayed, are we prepared to learn from the Ethiopian example about true spiritual wisdom? The certainty that the Ark of the Covenant rests in Ethiopia can completely transform our historical and spiritual perception. While the Western narrative often ignores or even minimizes the importance of non-European traditions, the possibility of the Ark being in Axum challenges this dominant perspective. Accepting this Ethiopian version requires a reassessment of the role of Africa not as a mere secondary setting, but as a central actor in divine history. The truth is that if the Ark is on Ethiopian soil, history would not just be a story of conquests and dominions, but a testimony of spiritual resistance and the protection of sacred secrets. The connection between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, in addition to being a diplomatic feat, symbolizes a spiritual connection that transcended its time. The Ethiopian tradition, kept in Kebra Nagast, not only praises this union, but eternalizes it through Menelik I, who would have taken the Ark to Africa. When considering that this sacred relic resides in Ethiopia, the prophecy that Ethiopia will stretch out her hands to God takes on new meaning. Ethiopia, in fact, already stretches out its hands, possessing the earthly throne of God, awaiting the moment when the truth will be revealed. What few realize is that over the centuries, Ethiopia has preserved its spiritual heritage with unwavering devotion. The Church of St. Mary of Zion in Axum symbolizes this profound commitment. Guarded by generations of priests, the Ark is not just a historical artifact, but a living symbol of a divine covenant. Ethiopian tradition does not see the Ark as a relic to be displayed, but as a sacred link that solidifies their faith and identity. This perspective, often viewed with skepticism, is a testament to Ethiopia's cultural and spiritual resilience. It turns out that if the Ark is one day revealed to the world, it would not only validate the Ethiopian narrative, but also redefine global understanding of religious history. Africa, often relegated to the background, would be recognized as a vital spiritual center. This revelation would not only alter the Judeo-Christian narrative, but also inspire a revival of interest and respect for African traditions. Ethiopia, which once played a significant role in the spread of early Christianity, would rise again as a global spiritual power. Historical records show that Ethiopia's influence on Christianity and Judaism is profound, but often underestimated. Ancient practices preserved by the Beta Israel and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church offer a glimpse into traditions that diverge from Western narratives. These traditions, kept intact over the centuries, are a powerful reminder of Africa's rich spiritual tapestry. The preservation of the Ark is therefore more than a matter of faith. It is an affirmation of Ethiopia's historical and spiritual continuity. The facts reveal that accepting the presence of the Ark in Ethiopia requires a willingness to re-evaluate deeply rooted historical and cultural prejudices. This acceptance could promote a more inclusive and respectful dialogue between religious traditions, recognizing Africa as a guardian not only of natural resources, but also of spiritual wisdom. Essa transformação de percepção é essencial em mundo que busca cada vez mais conexões autênticas e significativas. The question that remains is, are we ready to embrace this truth and recognize Ethiopia as a keeper of sacred secrets? The revelation of the Ark would not only illuminate the past, but also invite us to reimagine a future where Africa takes its rightful place as a spiritual center of global relevance.